Let's enjoy it. Good
Yeah,
luck.
we will. We will. Okay, we're now broadcasting, and we'll let people come in. Yeah, people are signing in now. You're very welcome, everybody, to this webinar on Viktor Frankl with Peter Purcell. We're going to wait a few minutes and hi until everybody's in. We've got about 50 people joining us today. My name is Jane Stevenson, and I've done this seminar in real time with Peter, and it is a wonderful, inspirational evening. So we thought we would repeat it, a shorter version of it, if you like, and encompass some questions from you. We want to take questions from the audience and hopefully have it as an interactive session. So I will briefly, because we've got now 40 of you signed up, so I will briefly just introduce the theme of this evening seminar. Well, a lot of you are probably familiar with Viktor Frankl, the reason that you're joining this seminar. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And Peter himself, when he read the book in 2012, it really touched him deeply. And in 2015, he received first-class honors and a postgraduate practitioner's diploma in logotherapy and existential analysis at Viktor Frankl Institute in Ireland. So he currently works as a clinical logotherapist, integrating the philosophy, theory, and practice into everyday life for people in business, sport, and healthcare. And he's an academic associate with Viktor Frankl Institute Ireland, accredited with the International Association of Logotherapy and Existential Analysis in Vienna. So there's no better man to talk about the teachings of Viktor Frankl than Peter in Ireland. And it is, as I say, during these rather difficult times of lockdown, etc., we need as much inspiration and hope. And we are going to focus on hope today. So this session will be about an hour in total. We're going to take questions. I'm going to hand you over to Peter, and I'm going to fade out here. But do please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A session or the chat session. We will address those. And so I will just now hand you over to Peter.
Thank you, Jane. I'll just share my screen. Good evening, everybody. And Jane, I guess you can tell me if you can see that okay. So
yes, I can see your screen share fine. Yeah.
Excellent. So I'm delighted to be here once again, everybody, and thank you so much for taking the time to join. Jane and I hope that you will enjoy this and take something from it. And in fact, that word hope, as Jane said, is key. Jane got on to me a number of weeks ago because she felt that this was more than just an opportunity to introduce something interesting. Maybe it could be something of real value. Because when you think about it, we were all told against our will we had to go into lockdown many weeks ago. And that's very similar to being incarcerated, simply because we're being told we have to do it. We had a limit on where we could go out. We had a limit on what we could do. And in many ways, that's very similar to being incarcerated in any other format. And there are certain characteristics that go along with that, whether it's entrance shock, even though we're in familiar surrounds like our home, but there is a shock element to it. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross put a very interesting process together on this that's worth having a look at sometime if you want to Google it. And she was a student of Viktor Frankl, and she looked at the process one goes through, which you may find some areas are very familiar to what you've all gone through. With the recent restrictions being lifted, you could say we're going through the phase of almost dismissal. And sometimes dismissal can not be everything it's made up to be. Certainly from Viktor Frankl's perspective, it wasn't quite what he had expected it to be, and many things disappointed him. But let's have a look at this evening. I'm going to go through a number of slides just to introduce you to the overall man and concept. And then I'm going to ask you if you could please grab a pen and paper. If you don't have one handy, why not find one now? I'll hang on a minute because I would like you to take the odd note and maybe do the odd exercise that I hope you might find helpful. So if you want to find a pen and paper, we'll hang on.
Peter, it's Jane here.
Yes,
we have a question already from Anne Hogarth. I don't know if you want to answer that now.
well, yeah, while people are getting a pen and paper, why not?
Yeah. Do you think the recent demonstrations worldwide relate to Frankl's observations on disillusionment follow emerging from prison? Sorry, I didn't read that very well. You might want to look at it at the base of your screen. The worldwide demonstrations.
Yes, Anne.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. I mean, without spending too much time on it, if Viktor Frankl was alive today, he'd be looking at that as being a sign of what he called the existential vacuum. And the existential vacuum was what Frankl termed as being that horrible void within us that, if we're not careful, can get filled up with lots of unproductive things. We all suffer from the existential vacuum, and it's critical that we find a way to fill it with things that are meaningful. It's when we spend any amount of time being really terrified about the fact we're on this earth as a singular person, and we're blessed if we've got people around us that we love and love us. More on the existential vacuum if we have time at the end. Okay, let's hope you all have a pen and paper at hand. To live is to suffer. To survive is to find meaning in the suffering. That's quite a phrase. Many people would think that's not the case. They would think actually to live is to be able to have our couple of cars, a couple of holiday homes, a couple of holidays a year. It's all about the highs, isn't it? Is it? Might be an interesting question. What is hope? Well, hope is certainty that something makes sense, regardless how it turns out. This was coined by Václav Havel, the Czech prime minister who died a number of years ago. I think this is a very relevant phrase, and it's a definition I'm very, very happy to include. Hope is certainty that something makes sense, regardless how it turns out. We're in a lot of uncertainty at the moment, and people are struggling to find certainty, but maybe they haven't thought about how hope can be part of that. Very briefly, Frankl, as you know or may not have known, survived 4 camps. And that was really not only an incredible stroke of luck, which he admitted himself, but it gave him time to really use his experiences a little bit like clinics, would you believe? And only for the fact he was able to say to himself at times that my professional research is going to help me make sense of this, he would have forgotten an awful lot of what he saw because it was so unimaginably horrible. But one of his key phrases that came out of this was, "May from unimaginable suffering spring forth a growing awareness of life's unconditional meaningfulness." A nice way to sum up what was really 3.5 years across 4 camps. If you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to dip back into it. If you have read it, I'd encourage you to dip back into it again. It's interesting, as we progress in our lives and our perspectives change, you actually can read things differently each time you read them. That's my experience. So while I've said I've read that book in the past, when I've read it a 3rd, 4th, or 5th time, or dipped into pieces of it or bits of it, I've seen things differently. So I'd encourage you to have a look, because most people forget that this is his classic tribute to hope. And again, hope being that certainty. Okay, very interesting. It wasn't the horrors that really got to Viktor Frankl when he had those experiences. It was the multitude of small torments. It was the injustices, the unreasonableness, the blunting of emotions. It wasn't the fact that there were hundreds of people going into the gas chambers that really were the key issues. again, an interesting perspective. Life in the camps tore open the human soul and exposed its depths. The phases were quite similar to what we've been going through with COVID: entrance shock, duration of stay, despair and dismissal. So, in terms of what you all experienced when being told to stay at home, how behaviors and attitudes changed or tempers frayed throughout the lockdown period, and then for some, the despair and dismissal, and the fact that while lockdown is eased, many things haven't changed at all. Just in terms of a quick summary of what they were experiencing in the camps: shock, panic, indifference, horror, curiosity, would you believe, and surprise. In terms of duration of stay, apathy, aggression, and despair were prominent. Again, if you see the incidences of domestic violence that you may have been following or hearing about over the lockdown period, they've skyrocketed. Time was a big factor. Things became uncertain. Time became deformed. There were ghostly experiences. It seemed limitlessness, space, past v present. Some of you may find that actually an hour feels like a week in some cases, and yet a week can sometimes feel like a day. So there's definitely been a deforming of time. Science has proven this to be a fact. In terms of dismissal, there was a lot of tension when they were being dismissed. There weren't whoops of joy. There was moral deformity. There was bitterness and disillusionment. And you might wonder why. On Liberation Day, imagine those four things, feeling those four things. You'd expect, the reason was that people had dreamt of what it would be like so often, but when the whistles woke them up at 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning, those dreams were shattered. They were afraid to believe it. They were also under a little bit like the bends biologically, when divers come up too quickly from the depths. If there's a release of tension too quickly, you can have a moral deformity, because you end up looking to either retribute, or you feel because of the hardship, you're going to take it out on people. The bitterness was really coming from, unfortunately, not really learning how to feel satisfied anymore. They felt bitter about things. And there was disillusionment, because when they got back to their villages, they were met with, would you believe, a shrug of the shoulders. Some people were saying, well, look, we didn't know about it. And we've had our suffering too. So what? Very disillusioning. And of course, throughout the incarceration, people were thinking things will be the same when we get back. So why hope? And this is really what I want to concentrate this evening on, because it's such an important capacity of the soul in many ways. And one of the things I'd like to ask you to do is just to concentrate on, would you write down what you think hope is? I'd like to suggest it's not optimism. So let's say optimism is the conviction that something will turn out well. It's not that. I'd also like to suggest it's not the same as joy. So it's not the same as things that are going to turn out well. So what do you think it is? If anybody would like to pop a word or two into chat for Jane, we can share some thoughts now, or for Q&A.
Okay, we have Sean Collins. Hope is something outside of me that will fix it.
Yeah, that's nice, Sean. Can you gain access to that? I quite like the definition we came up with earlier, where it's the certainty that something makes sense. Because if you go with that, there are very few things that are certain in our life.
There are a few more answers here.
Mm-hmm.
Vanessa says it's curiosity, growth, and change.
Nice.
There are several more here. I can just read them out to you. From C. Barrett, seeing beyond, sorry, that's just gone up. Seeing beyond the issue or suffering, seeing beyond the issue or suffering.
Yes. Yes.
Derval Dunford, a reason to keep going and to do what we're here to do.
Reasons very important, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on. Back to the certainty and uncertainty piece as well, Jane. I'd like you all, please, to maybe jot down 3 things that you know you cannot change in your life. Please write those down now.
We've got several more hope feedback.
Okay, we might come to those towards the end.
Okay.
So please write down 3 things that I cannot change in my life. And then please write 2 or 3 things that you can change in your life. Okay, who'd like to share maybe one thing that you cannot change in your life?
Carolyn Galenta says the past.
And that could be a very positive thing. If I could be reminded of that at the end, that could be a very positive thing.
Mary O'Brien says death.
Yes, 100%.
Jen McKenna says my family.
Yes. And let me give you a few more. Time, destiny, and death for Frankl was what he called one of his triads: pain, guilt, and death. Frankl called it his tragic triad of pain, guilt, and death. Certainly things we couldn't change. What about 1 or 2 things that you can change? Who'd like to suggest those?
Some things that you cannot change are other people. A couple of people who said other people or another person.
Yes. Well,
sometimes
not necessarily. Yeah.
I would have thought. Yeah.
So 1 or 2 that you can.
Dymphna Sullivan says life experience to date, personality, health. Oh, I think that's perhaps relating to your earlier question.
Yes.
What you can change are beliefs. Carolyn Galenta says beliefs, attitude. You can change your attitude and mindset from Jane O'Sullivan. You can, Derval Dunford, you can change your attitudes, dreams, directions in life. Your job, choices each day, yourself, future and present. Attitude, very much, a lot of people saying attitude.
Yeah, that's excellent. I wouldn't disagree with any of those. I might just ask you, and it's not for this evening, but what do you think attitude is and where does it reside? Because that's absolutely key. You're also able to change the way you attend to things. And attention is a very, very important part of how we get to know and learn anything, but also how we perceive things around us. And would you believe we attend to the world in 2 different ways together? It's intriguing. It's why our brain is split between our left and right cerebral hemisphere. I mean, there's no reason for it to be split. It's housed in a cylindrical skull. So why is the brain divided? So we actually attend to the world in two different ways together, because we have narrow attention and broad attention. But how we attend is also something we can change, and how we attend is very much within our power. But yes, attitude is key. To change one's attitude, though, and also somebody said to change your belief, that takes courage. And courage is a long-term virtue. Okay, many can be courageous short-term, but very few can be courageous long-term. And to be courageous over a longer time is all about endurance. And endurance is the essence of courage. And I think we've all asked to have been braver for longer over our current lockdown period. And we've got to find the hope to be braver for longer and endure it. So remember, endurance is the essence of courage. And there's two types of courage. You can be physically brave, and you will be a good leader if you are physically brave. But unfortunately, what restricts a good leader from being great is the lack of one other type of courage. And the Japanese lost the Second World War because of this lack of courage. And yet they were the bravest army in the world. I mean, they invented the kamikaze. Doesn't get braver than that. And then ISIS took that over very successfully in terms of the suicide bomber. What do you think, what courage did they lack? How could the bravest army in the world lose the Second World War because of a lack of courage?
Jen McKenna says, how we attend, explain how we attend, explain.
Okay, we'll
Come
pop
back to
that one out to the end if we could, Jane.
Okay.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
On courage, moral courage, Elizabeth Cody says.
Yes.
Mary Pierce says, courage to be vulnerable.
We'll stop it there, Jane, just in the interest of time. Moral courage is bang on.
Yeah.
And Jane, if you could take a note to remind me on attending, I'd like to answer that after.
Okay.
Yeah, moral courage is it. And unfortunately, many leaders today, it's hard to find both moral and physical. I know many who've had either or. But when you find somebody who's got both, and of course, moral courage is really that courage that allows you to have faith in a cause. And that's important. Okay.
Carolyn Galento says, saving face, the need to ignore responsibility.
Well, the need to ignore responsibility is tricky. Certainly saving face is very important, very significant in the Far East. I think what she may have meant is people who are saving face and ignoring their responsibility. I think that would certainly make sense. One other exercise I'd like you all to do pretty quickly, please, is could you just jot down one thing you did recently that had consequences for you? We don't have to share this publicly, but just one thing you did that had consequences for you. That could be positive or negative. Because I want to express gratefulness here. It was important for Frankl. But in terms of being grateful, if you could please jot down some pleasant things, I'd like you to jot down a word that comes to mind when I mention the following. Okay, so we're going to write some pleasant things down. So write a word down, please, that's to do with smell. It could be the aroma of a fine wine or the summer grass being cut. Okay, smell. Please write down a word for sound, a pleasant word for sound. For taste. for sight, and a pleasant word for texture. And then please just jot down privately, who are you grateful to and for what? Who are you grateful to and for what? And then please jot down, what relevance is today for me and in my life? What relevance is today for me and in my life? So what relevance is today for me and in my life? And is my life worthwhile? Question mark. Has it been worth the effort? Is my life worthwhile? Has it been worth the effort? Because if we go back to hope, it's also the ability to work for something because it's good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. And having that faith in a cause because it's good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed, is really you having a willingness to work for something important and meaningful to you. And really what I'm getting at here is the very foundations of morale. A word that we don't hear a lot about these days. It was very significant for Frankl, obviously over his lifetime, but it's very significant in business today and in communities. You know, what's morale like at home over COVID-19? What's morale like in the estate, in your community? And morale is a state of mind and a mixture of emotion and reason. And a number of you have touched on some of these thoughts before. So to have a worthy cause and to really feel a real part in it and who you are and what I do and what you do counts. That's, I think, what Leo Varadkar was trying to get across when he made his speech a number of weeks ago as we all went into lockdown. You have a part to play here, and this part is less to do with you and more to do with somebody else. And really what they were trying to do is improve morale. But it's all linked to hope, and it's all linked to this state of mind. And this is attitudinal. And yes, we have the capability and the capacity to change our attitude, because attitude is spiritual. And we are of free will, I would suggest, that allows us to take a stand against anything. And that is attitudinal. You're very, very powerful, very powerful. So the foundations of morale, if you're interested, are mental, psychological, material, and spiritual. And spiritual not in terms of religious, but in terms of that faith in a cause. Mental, because it's very much a case of, is it achievable? Um, what are the effects of this going to be on me? Will my time be wasted if I participate in this? What's the purpose of it all? What sort of return will I get? These are all psychological aspects. Materialism, would you believe, is a foundation of morale, because the conditions don't have to be great for morale still to be high. But what is important is, if conditions aren't good, that they're recognized, and that you're either able to say to somebody or somebody's able to say to you, look, we realize things aren't good. Here's how we're going to try and improve them, or here's the amount of time we hope that will be required here. And that gives us some sort of bookending. Very important. So they're the foundations of morale. Any comments there, Jane, that you want to bring up, or will we continue?
Well, I mean, there are some that that were relating to your hope question, and this is a lovely one from Christian Merkel. Hope is an unconditioned belief in the inherent goodness of existence.
Lovely.
Isn't that lovely?
It is lovely. Many people will struggle, though, with that inherent belief. And it's wonderful if somebody has that, but many don't. And I think it's a case of looking at where endurance fits in with all of this, because an awful lot of what we hear about today is work-life balance. It's making sure we have less stress in our lives, when in fact the key messages from Frankl around hope were, no, it's the opposite. It's how do we endure it, not run away from it. How do we find the capacity within us to become worthy of the suffering? And that's really following the thread that we're talking about, because when we find purpose in that through hope, we're really finding the why. We're really finding the reason. And once we have a reason, a why for something, we can decide to endure it or not. And Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, who was in many ways controversial, he was seen as a great reductionist, but his wonderful phrase summed it up, that if you have a why in life, you can put up with almost any how. And really what Nietzsche was getting at there is that if you have a reason for something in your life, if you have a reason for something or someone, well, then you will choose to endure it or not. Don't forget you're that powerful. Endure it or not. End it or not. It's your choice. Homicide, suicide, genocide. We're capable of all of it. And even Socrates said he had the incredible capacity to become a criminal, but just chose not to, I think, to all our benefit. So again, hope will lead to the why, or even the purpose could lead to hope. That links directly to the endurance, allowing you to, at its best, would you believe, even become worthy of that suffering. And would you believe, in some cases, become willing to suffer. This is why people endure. It's why people commit. It's why they go the extra mile. And when morale is high because of those foundations, you can summon from within the spirit those capacities. And you all have those capacities within you, but sometimes they're blocked, and they're blocked for many reasons. So I thought tonight, without sounding too audacious, if Viktor Frankl was here and was talking to us all, what would he like to say about hope? And what would he like to say about the conditions we're in at the moment? Well, I think the first thing he'd say is that those conditions are subject to our decisions. Our decisions are not subject to those conditions. He would have been vigorously saying that to us. What he saw in his 3.5 years in the conditions of camps were the people that let go, the ones that lost their inner hold. It was a choice. That's incredibly powerful. They chose to let go. So I felt he'd also like to talk to us this evening about what was really what he called his ontology of time, his thinking around the present, the future, and the past. And what he'd suggest to us is that right now, the mood is low in some cases, because don't forget, we're not saying hope is optimism. It's not that something's necessarily going to turn out well, but the mood is low. And in some cases, tempers are reaching their lowest ebb. There's a lot on our minds. And we're emerging from lockdown and incarceration as prisoners that are imposed by the state.
There's a good comment here, Peter, from Elizabeth Cody. Morale is improved during COVID if you give yourself time to explore your present day and your future hopes.
Yes, absolutely. Now, Frankl would also say, because of this low mood and because of the uncertainties facing us, what irreplaceable loss have each of us suffered that can't be restored or achieved again? Now, I know for some of you, there may well have been an irreplaceable loss. You may have lost somebody, a loved one very close to you, and that is an irreplaceable loss. But for those of you that haven't, what irreplaceable loss have each of us suffered that can't be restored? That's a very important question. We may have lost irreplaceable things. We may have lost things that aren't. I mean, money, fame, pride, they can all be got again. If we're alive, we've reason for hope, don't we? Would you believe again, Nietzsche said, that which does not kill you makes you stronger. That was him. If we're alive, we've reason for hope. So that's what I think Viktor Frankl would say to us about today. Because when you've lost what sometimes seems important to you, and all there is left is for you to just be, that can be your most authentic self. And I think we need to get back to some of that. He had a wonderful expression, I don't think I can remember it now, but it was when we're melted down in the white heat of suffering, when we're melted down to our most authentic self. It's wonderful. And don't forget, Wildgans, a famous English poet, said back in it might have been the 13th or 15th century, to give light. What was it he said again? To give light must come burning. So you cannot have light without burning. You cannot have hope without a degree of pain. In terms of what Frankl might say to us about the future, his ontology of time again was today, the present, the future, and the past. In terms of the future, I think he would have said that no one knows, obviously, but what chances come about? We know that many chances do come about. And choices. What has passed is gone in many ways. And we'll come to past in a minute. But what has passed has gone. But if we aren't actioning things today, we're not actually creating our future. And this is where apathy and boredom come in. So while we don't know what it is, we've got to stay busy, get up, go forward, take a step forward, do something. And his thinking around the future was that we must grasp something through action and rescue it safely and securely into the past. So whatever we didn't do today because of choices we made, they're gone forever. Whatever we did do today because of the choices we made, we should be proud of that, irrespective of how they've turned out. We did something. It's better than doing nothing. The important thing is to do something. And when you do something, he beautifully said, you're actioning it, but you're rescuing it into the past forever because you've made it happen, whatever it may be. It's less about the outcome, but let's make sure we have something that we're rescuing from all of the things that we have choices to do. There are so many choices we have that we can do. It's really knowing what at times.
I have a question from Dominic Martin. How long does it take to train your mind to choose the right response?
Gosh, Dominic, I'm not sure if you can train it to choose the right response, because it's a little bit like a chess move. What's the best move in chess? I know, there isn't one. What I would say, Dominic, there is, don't worry about training your mind. Whatever your response is, and I'm going to suggest your response is not a reaction. There is a difference. If you've responded, I'm impressed, because your reaction, while it might have been important, it may have been too instinctual and off the cuff and landed you in trouble. But if you've responded, you've been response-able. You've been able to respond. That's linked to being responsible. Your right response is your response, Dominic. It is right. Just because it might have been a negative consequence, if it was, or if it is in the future, doesn't mean it's wrong. You've got to learn from it. This is why we've got to stop asking, what is the meaning of life? It doesn't exist in generic terms. Life's asking us the questions. And we've got to respond to life's question and answer session by being responsible. And of course, to be responsible, we've got to be free. You can't be responsible and not be free. You can be free without being responsible, but that's got consequences. So Dominic, your response, whatever it may be, is the right one for you. The meaning of life is very personal. And it's really a case of saying, not what do I expect of life, but what does life expect of me? It's asking you the questions, and the way you respond to that is right for you. So please be confident in your response, irrespective of the outcome, but be confident it's right for you. You're the important one in that. In terms of the past, and this question came up, or it was something certainly was mentioned earlier, and I want to talk about the past. This is really one of the most powerful ways of considering the past. We're all very guilty of not clapping ourselves on the back and looking at what we've achieved in the past. We tend to see them as stubble fields, and we're worried about the future or the present. And we don't rate ourselves very highly in some cases. If you do, well, that's great. That's fantastic. And I hope you don't overdo it. But at the same time, I don't stay still. But a lot of us don't. We look back in vain at what's been achieved. And I'm going to guess you've achieved a lot. You've achieved suffering, sorrow, love, joy. I'm sure you've gone through all of that. That's a lot to be proud of. Think about what you've rescued into the past for eternity. Think about what you've done that can never be taken away from you. It's there, it's fixed. It's like that egg timer. The future are the grains at the top coming through the very narrow present and congesting because there's so much we could be doing. But when they settle at the bottom, let's assume it's cemented into the ground so we can't turn it over. They're fixed. That's not necessarily a negative thing, because the beauty is whatever you've rescued into the past can never be taken from you. I'm going to suggest it's the monument to your existence. And that can be a good one, or it can be a not so good one. And the bad news is, that's up to you. But that's where the responsibility lies. But in many ways, you're a sculptor. And you're crafting that monument this evening, and tonight, and tomorrow. And you're responsible as to what you make out of yourself. But be clear that everything you have done in the past is there forever, for eternity. And in many ways, it's the most surest form of having been. It's quite strange, this. When anyone loses a loved one, obviously they are physically gone, but the sense people have of somebody being with them is really the sense of their past. And having been can be the most secure form of being in many ways. When you consider the fact that who they were and what they did has not gone away. So please think of that in terms of the past. And Frankl's ontology of time is really a wonderful study, and he dips into that in the second half of Man's Search for Meaning, where he beautifully stitches in the principles of logotherapy. So I'd encourage you to have a peep at that. In terms of the opportunities then to give all of this a sense of meaning, don't ask the question, what's the meaning of it all? And I'll tell you why. Many people came up to Frankl in the camps and said, we expect nothing more from this. You know, if I don't survive it, there will have been no meaning to my suffering. People would have thought similarly to the recession 10 years ago. If I don't get out of this recession, the suffering and the loss of money and the loss of assets will have meant nothing. Well, if Frankl was here this evening, he'd have said, no, that is not the way to think about it. The way to think about it is, where or what could the meaning of this suffering be? It's got to be in it. Because if it's not, what's the point of surviving? He reversed it. Do you really want to survive? Because it's going to come down the tracks again. What's going to happen next week? What's going to happen next month, next year? You can be very sure there's a lot more suffering to be got through. So let's close the loop and get back to enduring it and trying to find hope in that endurance, because there's a lot of suffering to be got through. So it's how we discover meaning in it, because nobody wants to survive, surely, if there isn't any meaning in it. So I'd encourage you to not give up hope. Think about what makes sense to you, regardless of how it turns out. What makes sense to you, regardless of how it turns out? What matters to you? Is there a reason to be hopeful? Explore and search for a reason. You may have saved many lives by what you've done in the last 2 or 3 months. You should also have pride in complying if you have. And by the way, if you're feeling guilty for not, that's also something to be proud of, because it's your prerogative to feel guilty, would you believe? If nobody's feeling guilty, they're not living. You've got to make decisions. Just because it turned out to be a wrong one for you, hopefully you've learned from it, and the next one you'll make mightn't be as wrong. But it's your prerogative to become guilty. But it's also your responsibility to get over your guilt as an adult. So work on that as well, please. But in terms of really not giving up hope, how do you do this? One exercise would be, I'm going to suggest you learn to prime yourselves. Priming is very important. If you could just take your pen for a moment, please, and write down the following letters for me. Capital S, capital O, space P. Capital S, capital O, space, capital P. Okay, now I want you to think of a nice, relaxing Radox bath full of bubbles, and then fill in the word for me, please. Okay, now I'd like you to write the same 3 letters, capital S, capital O, space, capital P. And now I'd like you to think of a nice restaurant. You're going to have a quick sandwich at lunch one day, but you'd like something hot to accompany it. And I'd like you to fill in that word as well, please. Okay, I'm going to guess that your first word was soap and your second word was soup. The reason I'm right is because I primed you. Okay, we get primed the whole time. I broke it down a little bit there because I wanted to show you the explicit nature of it. But we can prime ourselves. And one way I'd like you to prime yourselves is to find a way to remind yourself each morning or any time during the day to ask yourself, one, to whom am I responsible today? To whom am I responsible today? What is expected of me today? By who and for what? If you ask yourself those two questions, you will instill an immediate sense of responsibility in yourself. The reason priming works is that it exposes you to a stimulus. Okay, so exposure to that stimulus influences your response to a later stimulus. So exposure to a stimulus, like a warm bath, influences your response to a later stimulus. Writing down the letters. Okay, and that's where I think formally I'd like to end the chat before there's any questions, because stimulus was important to Frankl. And I'd like to leave you with a phrase that was one of his most profound and one of his most beautiful. And that is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom to choose our response. And in that response lies our growth and our freedom. So between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom to choose our response. And in that response lies our growth and our freedom. And that is saying that between our reactions, biologically and instinctually, which are important and have kept us alive in many ways, but they've also got us into trouble, between those reactions and between us responding, there is that space. And that space, of course, is very similar to the graphic we're looking at now. It's enormous.
Peter, can you send me that statement and I will send it out to everybody after this session?
I can indeed.
It's a fabulous quote.
I can indeed. And as you can see...
And we do have a couple of questions. What was the second question for priming? What was your second question?
Oh, I think I got them to think of a restaurant and you were having a sandwich. I got them to write the same letters down, S-O-P.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah.
It was priming, and they probably put soup.
Yeah, soup and soap, yeah.
Just an example of how one can get primed. And we, of course, advertising primes us the whole time. I remember being primed once after playing a sports match. Somebody came up to me and said, they said, you know, you had a great first half. You really did. I've never seen you play so well. You did these things really well. How do you think I did? And of course, I wasn't likely to look at him and go, I thought you were terrible. I thought you had your worst game ever. But, you know, he had primed me. Anyway, just something you may all be interested in. Would you believe Viktor Frankl, when he was alive, said that the greatest symbol of liberty in the world in New York, the Statue of Liberty, won't be complete until we build a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. So Frankl started a project to have a Statue of Responsibility built on the West Coast of America to complement the Statue of Liberty on the East. And this is the statue that's in project at the moment, would you believe? And if it gets completed in the future, it will be just that. It'll complement liberty on the East with responsibility on the West. So Jane, that really concludes the sort of the formal piece.
Peter, sorry, just before you go, Siobhan, what are the two questions to self each day?
Sure. By the way, I wasn't going to go. I was just going to end the formal piece. If anybody wants to stay
Okay,
on
I
and ask
don't know. I
questions,
put my
they're more than
video on,
welcome.
but I don't seem to be up there. But anyway, it doesn't matter. You're the main person.
Well, I can stop sharing, Jane,
Oh, there
now.
we go.
Yeah.
So Siobhan has asked the two questions to self each day again.
Oh, yeah. The two questions I think should be, what is expected of me today? What is expected of me? Instead of saying, what do I expect? Because we all wake up in the morning saying, well, you know, subconsciously, even, what do I expect today from family, work? But reverse it. So what's expected of me today? And to whom and for what am I responsible today?
Yeah.
If you ask those two questions, they immediately instill a sense of responsibility. And it's meant to create a bit of healthy tension within you. And it's meant to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Believe me, sound mental health, it's a prerequisite for sound mental health to have healthy tension in the system. It's not balance. Balance is not good. We need healthy tension between who we are today and who we're trying to become. And this is a message we're not getting. It's a bit like saying, let's medicalize away stress. Let's medicalize away suffering. No, let's learn to endure it. Let's learn to live with it. This is Frankl's key messages. We endure it, and we endure it by being able to find hope in it, because we see the certainty of the good in what we're trying to achieve. It's why people stay with things and why they're braver for longer, because they believe in them. Doesn't mean it's going to work out necessarily, but it's resilient because it's got good as far as you're concerned. It's like Dominic's question about training for the better reasons or for the better answers. No, it's good if it's yours. It's
Dominic said, thank you very much for that answer, by the way.
Oh, not at all. Pleasure.
I've got a couple of challenging questions here from Sean Collins early on in this session. His first one is human evolution on hold? You
know, that's quite interesting. My answer would be, according to who, Sean, would you like your answer? If you'd like Peter Purcell's opinion, I'd share, but otherwise according to who, because isn't so much of what we learn and know from so many others. But if it's my opinion you're looking for, no, I wouldn't say it's on hold. I think, I hope it's not. I think human evolution is a wonderful thing. I do think, though, that evolution is about maturity. And if you can forgive me moving into an area where I think that we're lacking maturity, but because it's such an influential role at the moment, if we see the most powerful nation in the world suffering from somebody being out of their depth, but also being very immature, I think that really questions evolution. I think it imbues us all with greater responsibility to have the courage of our convictions, to face up to our responsibilities, not always go with the status quo and what's politically correct, and really push for what we believe is decent and right. It's not all about Black lives. It's about all lives. I mean, I was picked up recently for saying discrimination is a good thing, and I'd like to say it again tonight. It immediately makes people wince, and of course it's meant to, because it's a play on words. If we don't discriminate down to the individual, a bit like Dominic, if we don't discriminate down to the uniqueness of the individual, well, then it's collectivism. And collectivism is bordering on utilitarianism. We're all going to be told what to do. No, it's not about the crowd. It's about having the courage of the conviction of the individual. We're all unique. Let's judge everybody on the unique and special level, not on the color of their skin and the collective nature of race and habits. There's really two races, I think, decent and not decent, period.
I would agree with that. Sean's other question is, maybe we don't want to accept responsibility for hope.
Maybe, Sean. And that moral courage is not easy. But what I would suggest is a minority of people have it, but let's get more to join the minority. Try it. If you know people who are lacking it, pick them up on it. The messages are so confusing these days. Be careful what you say and to who. You'll get turned around to be stabbed. Don't say anything in public if it'll cause confrontation. Moral courage is a divine attribute. We need more of it. Try it sometime. Personally, if it's something you feel you need to improve on, it's something I need to improve on constantly. When I try it, I get great strength from it. It's wonderful.
But there is such mob rule nowadays, Peter, isn't there? There's real mob rule with social media. There
is. But again, maybe use social media at your discretion. I mean, what's really the value of it? It's a broadcast mechanism, folks, in my opinion. It's very little discussion. Engagement and conversation is about asking questions and listening and responding. And trying to find that hidden meaning in that. Social media is wonderful in many ways, but it's a broadcast mechanism. That's one way. It's directional. It's just be careful how you use it. I would urge you to use it at your discretion.
Well, yes, that's true. Carol says, surely being loved is important in order to have hope.
Well, I think I remember a time where I was hoping I'd be loved. So, of course, it depends romantically and not romantically. They're both very important. I think you're very lucky if you're romantically loved and you're able to love romantically. That's if you've somebody special in your life, that's wonderful. And if the trust is there, that's amazing. But we've many other loves, don't we? I mean, I love the audience I can't see tonight, just at a human level, because that's the way I am. So, yes, I think, though, hope, I think we need to be careful what we hope for. I just think we can very easily get it mixed up with optimism. Imagine if you were hoping to be loved. Is that really optimistic? Is it saying that I want something to turn out well? So I just think it needs a little bit of thought, but not too much. The self-help industry, I wouldn't be a great supporter of it. It's really less about us. It's really all about what's out there, whether that's someone else or something else. A little bit of reflection, but not too much. Otherwise, it's a hall of mirrors.
So you think the self-help industry is a crutch for people, or a lot of those people?
I think it has helped many, and I obviously don't judge that at all. That's wonderful. Yeah. But I think people who search within it and aren't finding results, I'm not surprised.
Okay.
I think a lot of it is saying it's too much about you. It's really about self-transcendence. I think even Maslow admitted his self-actualization at the top of his pyramid is very, very hard to achieve. Would you believe he admitted to Frankl that actually it wasn't the ultimate need? And Frankl coined in a phrase, he said, well, self-actualization is the unintended consequence of life's intentionality. And what he meant is, when we intend for something to happen, if we go and intend for something at all, whatever it is, what follows can sometimes be precisely what we weren't aiming for. So maybe a way to self-actualize is to get up in the morning and make sure you don't self-actualize. And certainly don't ask to do it. And maybe a way to be happy is to get up in the morning and not try to be happy. I know many people who are hunting happiness, and of course they're missing it. And I know many people who are hunting love, and of course they're missing it. Why? Because there needs to be a reason for these things. When we don't have a reason, these are conditions. They can't be pursued. They must ensue. Imagine I started this evening, or imagine if Jane started this evening and said, I'd like to introduce to Peter Purcell. Now, I want you to like him and find him funny. It's a little bit like
I was priming the audience.
Exactly, priming. Actually, Jane, that's a brilliant point. I remember being primed growing up in the Catholic Church. I was told to believe by the priests every Sunday. I was forced to go to Mass. And I remember in my late teens wondering, not that I did or didn't, I won't get into that, but I just remember being told I was being forced to do something that doesn't come naturally. I need a reason to believe. I don't want to be told by somebody at the top of the church to believe. Now, luckily, I found a few reasons, but if there wasn't a reason, I was actually having something forced down my throat that had to ensue. So self-actualization is the unintended consequence of life's intentionality. So really, the courage to not go after things that we want. I'll nearly go as far as to say I could guarantee there's a very good chance that they will follow precisely because you haven't gone after them. And I'd ask you to try and summon the courage to do that. And it's the same with money. You know, many people who go after money, they find money very evasive. The ones I know who have lots of it, it tends to have them. So they're not going after it for its sake. They're going after it for something completely different, but that has them in and there's obviously many who have both and they're very fulfilled. But this brings me on to a point, I don't know if we've time for it, but there is a phenomenon out there that Frankl would, I think, be very keen for a lot of people to know more about. And that is the phenomenon of this mode of success and failure. If you draw a line, for those of you that still have a pen, if you want to draw a horizontal line and have at one end success and the other end failure, okay, and then with the same pen draw a vertical line and have fulfillment and despair at either end. So now you should have a matrix, 4 boxes. Most people get sucked into the success failure. They judge their life on that, a little bit like looking back in the past. We're somewhere along that journey. And success can be measured in material things or not material things. But what people don't understand is that for people with a self-transcendent approach to life and with a slightly broader vision, they also see that they've been either in fulfillment or despair. That's why the phenomenon exists of despair despite success and fulfillment despite failure. So you can close that box off in your matrix. Despair despite success, you can close that square off. Do you often wonder why many, many millionaires kill themselves? Do you often wonder why people who you know who seem to have so much don't seem to be that fulfilled? It's a phenomenon. Likewise, why do people who have so little sometimes seem to be so at peace with themselves? That's fulfillment despite failure. And don't forget, these are perceived failures, perceived successes. So this phenomenon is important and was very important to Frankl because it's the difference between the perspective we take on life. Fulfillment, failure, suffering, and despair are not outside of life. They're part of life. And one of his most famous equations was D equals S minus M. And this will be the last thing I'll ask you to write down before Jane just has to cut me off. D equals S minus M in capital letters. And that is despair is suffering without meaning. D equals S minus M. So where we suffer and we can't discover meaning in it, we fall into despair. But where we can discover meaning in our suffering, guess what? We're able to endure it. We're able to suffer it. We're willing to, in some cases, go on. And we've just closed the circle and we found a reason to be hopeful.
Peter, I have a few more comments here for you. Dominic asks, where does living according to our values come into this?
Oh, hugely important, Dominic. It's another whole session. Values are a tricky thing to bring up because part of modern day living in the 21st century has seen things like tradition and values not be passed on to the next generations like they used to be. And we've seen the crumbling of many of these traditions, whether it be institutions like religion, governments. So tradition and values aren't as prominent, but where they are, they play a huge part because values are the very things that distill meaning in your life. So you discover meaning through values. And there are three categories of values that allow you to discover meaning. One is creative values. And these are the values that we give to our life. They can be choosing to work, something you're making, something you're drawing, something you're writing, something you're developing. It can be anything, but it's what you're creating and giving to the world. Those creative values distill a lot of meaning. The second category of values that discover meaning are experiential. It's what you take from the world. It's what you experience. Love, music, beauty, art. And what we experience and take from the world positively is another way to distill and discover meaning. But the most important category of value to discover meaning is attitudinal values. And these are values where you find if you're in a position where you are not able to create a work and you're not able to give, but sadly you're not able to experience, well, it doesn't become sad anymore because you are free to choose your attitude towards that. And attitudinal values are the highest category of values to discover meaning. Not high in terms of integrity, but high because they include the creative and the experiential, but transcend them. Because don't forget, whatever hardship and suffering you're going through, you are free to choose your attitude towards that. You are free to take a stand towards that. And that's the ultimate freedom that allows you to become the bearer of how you attend to it and therefore the outcome. Attention, actually, Jane, was something we needed to return to very quickly.
Oh, yes.
Just for if that person is still on, there's a wonderful book called The Master.
Jen McKenna, I think. Yeah.
Gemma.
Jen McKenna. Jen. She's
Jen.
here. She's here. Yeah.
Hi, Jen. Jen, this is a very important subject. Would you believe, attending to the world in two different ways together is phenomenal. It's a fact. And I'll give you the source of the fact shortly, but just imagine it this way. Let's go back to the pre-Socratics. Okay, the pre-Socratics are obviously before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So we're talking here about the likes of Parmenides, or one of the more famous ones would have been Heraclitus. Heraclitus had a wonderful phrase. He said, "You never step into the same river twice." Now, what did he mean by that? When you step into a river and then step out of it, that water is gone. When you step back into it, it's new water, isn't it? So this really upset him. And it made him think, how do we get to know anything if this constant flux is in motion? If everything's moving the whole time, how do we get to know anything? What's the foundation of our knowledge, of our learning? And he thought about this for years and years, and it was a real issue. But of course, the way to do it is we have to fix it as it flies. And a modern day way of thinking of it is Pinterest. This Pinterest thing where you can pin photographs to a board. We need to stop things in our tracks and pin it. And when we stop something in our track and pin it, then we get to know it. When we get to know it, we recognize it. When it's recognizable, we can then compare it to something else. And of course, when something's comparable, it's knowledge and we can learn it. It's when something's not comparable we've no knowledge of it, and it becomes very frightening for people. But that comparison then allows us to learn and grow and become very powerful. But to do that, to fix something when it flies in the constant flow and motion of life, is potentially one very interesting hypothesis as to why the brain is divided. One cerebral hemisphere is all about the open flux, the cosmic openness, and everything in motion, the big picture. And the other hemisphere is there to fix it as it flies so that we can know it. They're both critically important. But there's been a very interesting study in to say, why is the left cerebral hemisphere growing at a bigger rate than the right? Science today is showing that the right cerebral hemisphere is very much the broad attention. And there has been, there's a wonderful TED talk by, if I could remember her name, she's a neuroscientist who had a stroke.
Jill Bolt Taylor.
Thank you, Jane. Jill Bolt Taylor doesn't realize this, but she is a living study of the right cerebral hemisphere and the left. Because Jill talks about how when she got the stroke and lived through it, do you remember, Jane, she spoke about being in the shower and suddenly the arm disappeared and she was in this cosmic oneness. And then suddenly she thought, oh my God, I've got to pick up the kids and get the shopping. And so the left was kicking in. We need both, but this is all attention. It's all about how we attend. What really, Jen, is coming out of this is we have the power to choose where we attend. It's been scientifically proven that instantaneously it's the right. We don't build up the big picture from bits. We get the gestalt in a nanosecond. That gets passed to the left, which breaks it up into bits. It then should really go back to the right again to be put into context. But what's happening over the last couple of thousand years is they're finding it's not getting put into context as much. So an example might be you go to the doctor, you've got a dodgy knee. The doctor says, I'm going to have to amputate your leg. I'm the best surgeon in the world. Don't worry. I'll cut it off. You won't feel a thing. It'll be wonderful. You won't die. But that doctor doesn't spend any time in helping you recover from the trauma. Technically, he's very brilliant. He's staying in his left. He's doing everything technically by the book, but he should step back out of context and say, I'm a person who happens to be a world-class surgeon approaching another person who happens to be a patient. That's a very different perspective from saying I'm a world-class surgeon who's attending to a patient who's paying me money to do a job. So very different perspectives. So we have the choice where we want to land our attention. It's why, Jen, attention is a moral act, would you believe? It's fascinating. Anyway, the source of all of this, if you're interested, is a wonderful guy called Ian McGilchrist. And Ian wrote a book over 20 years. And Jane doesn't know this yet, but I'm going to talk to Jane about bringing Ian to Ireland. And Ian, his book is called The Master and His Emissary. It's going to take me about as long to read it as it took him to write it. I've studied it. He's a wonderful guy. I'm on to him quite often. He pings me back an email, an automatic one that says it'll be 6 months before we talk because, it's an automatic thing. But then I tend to get an email in 2 hours. He's very good to me. The Master and His Emissary is Ian's wonderful work. Google him, YouTube him, please. He is linking art, music, poetry, politics, and life to why the left cerebral hemisphere is growing bigger than the right, because the left is the emissary, the right is the master, and the left wants to become the master, because the left cerebral hemisphere only knows what it knows. It doesn't have the context. And it's why we're living in a rather algorithmic, bitty, broken down into bits world. Why is everything becoming so spreadsheet orientated? Well, it could be interesting because it gives us great power. It allows us measure things. But surely there's time where we need to just go for that walk and just be. So
yes,
very interesting.
We have several comments about that, actually. Elizabeth mentioned that a couple of times about the importance of this time to focus on the present, but also look at the past and then look to the future as well. And it's a time for reflection, which I think is very powerful.
Very. We must not be guilty for doing nothing.
Yeah.
we've got to do nothing at times.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
But we're all told don't, be busy, be active. No.
I think we live in a very frantic world.
We do. We live in a frantic and quite serious world. And while I'm not too upset about the seriousness, because if we sat back and really did think about our responsibility to anyone or anything, it could actually become overwhelming. So instead, we're running away from the existential vacuum a lot of the time. People are terrified about this void within us, and they fill their lives with busy things and think they're great. You might be great. You could be doing an awful lot of wonderful work, but there is time to explore that void and grow. Absolutely. But it's frightening.
Yes. Well, here's a big question for you from Dimpner O'Sullivan. Do you believe in life after death?
I don't believe in life as we know it right now after I die. I don't think I'm going to have the same tactile, sensory experiences for some reason. I don't know why I think that. But I do have a very strong sense that it's not all over. I'll give you a quick example. Who answered that? Who asked that, Jane?
Dimpner O'Sullivan.
Dimpner,
yeah.
Dimpner, I've got a little dog at home here, Polly, and she's a Cavalier King Charles. And one thing I'm pretty certain about Polly is she doesn't understand why I have her. She doesn't know why I have her, how much I enjoy her, and the family are pretty sure she doesn't understand the meaning of her being with us either. And that makes me think, if she doesn't understand that meaning, when I bring her to the vet and she gets an injection, she looks up at me. And it's as almost to say, I'm going to trust you, my owner, that whatever this person does is going to be okay. And this makes me wonder, if that human-animal divide is there, could there be a divide between us and something greater? And are we also a little bit unsure as to what the meaning of our existence could be, for who, for what? And if we have that trust in whatever it is exists outside of ourselves that we choose to believe in, is it similar? I don't see why not. I'm intrigued by all of that. So I'm open to it all too.
I think, Peter, we've run out of questions. So unless anybody wants to quickly send one in, but we did say we'd be doing an hour, and we've done slightly more than that. So thank you very, very much for your time. And we've got several thank yous here, which is lovely. And let me know about Ian Gilchrist, and we'll do perhaps something in the future with him.
Lovely. Jane, thank you again.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your time. And thank you all very, very much for attending. And we'll keep you posted on future webinars.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.